I just now hear a blue jay sitting out on the bird feeder outside squawking. So ignore that if you start to hear the blue jay. All right, well, I'm happy today to talk with you about the press and the presidency and the relationship between the two, especially in times of crisis, such as what we are facing now. I guess we all kind of have, we're kind of wondering about this era which we're living in. Donald Trump has made no, secret of, taking the media to task, talking about fake news media. He goes so far as to say they're a danger to our country, especially takes on the New York Times and CNN and the Washington Post. And likewise, we see the journalists are challenging him. In some cases, they will point out that he's lying or even call him a liar. And you're like, what is going on here? Is this normal? So as I thought about this relationship between the press and the presidency and what I wanted to say to you today, I thought what I wanted to do was kind of give some perspective on this relationship. And then we can talk a little bit more about how it's playing out in today's time with the pandemic. So as I thought about it, a few things came to my mind that I felt like I could say with certainty. And that is that the antagonisms between the press and the presidency are not new. In fact, biased news is not new. Even fake news is not new. Both the press and the presidency have evolved over the years in response to each other's expanding power. These tensions seem to get worse, honestly, in times of social and political and economic crises. And it really comes down to the audience and the voters who have the responsibility to seek out the truth. So this fighting between the press and the presidency goes back almost to the beginning of our country's history. In 1798, Congress passed the Sedition Act, which made it illegal for anyone to express any false, scandalous, or malicious writing against Congress and the president. And John Adams used this act to pursue those newspaper editors he did not like, and he would fine them or put them in prison. It's important to understand that the press at this time, which was the newspapers, of course, it's different. We had a different model than what we have today. At that time, it was what we would call the party press. The newspapers depended upon the government to give them government printing contracts. And because of that, the newspapers started to align themselves with the political parties. So there would be Federalist newspapers and Democratic Republican newspapers. And depending on who was in office, those newspapers would attack their opponents. We see that this continued on with Thomas Jefferson, who succeeded John Adams. Jefferson, we think of as being, more open-minded and tolerant. He's the author of the Declaration of Independence. He generally spoke well of the news media or newspapers of his time. And yet, by the time he becomes president, he himself has started to become under attacks from the press. And he, at one point, made the statement, "Nothing can be believed now which is seen in a newspaper." In his time, there was an editor, I think, who was particularly interesting, named James Callender. And Callender had started off supporting the Democratic Republicans. And he would attack the Federalists, such as Alexander Hamilton. And he had revealed that Alexander Hamilton had an extramarital affair. But then when Jefferson did not give him the political appointment he wanted, he turned his back on Jefferson and started to attack Jefferson. And he was the one who revealed that Jefferson had an affair with his slave, Sally Heming, and had several children by her. So the attacks were very personal at this time, and they continued on, we see, with the party press with Andrew Jackson. He runs for office, and one of the newspapers says that his mother had been a common prostitute brought to the country by British soldiers, and that she had married a mulatto man with whom she had several children, of which General Jackson was one. And so we see this as, again, example of not only biased news, but what we would call today fake news. And so how did these presidents respond? Well, through the 19th century, they started to realize they needed to develop more of a sophisticated messaging system, what we call public relations or spin control. And so what is spin? Well, it has a number of different aspects to it. Certainly one part is just information, providing information, but it's that information with a slant. It's getting the message out the way the president wanted it to be portrayed. There's certainly argument to it, and there's a bit of selling to this. making the president seem like he and his policies are good. Certainly there's publicity. It is all propaganda, which is, of course, and biased messaging. And it's about the image that the president creates for himself. And again, it's a way of messaging. So in the 19th century, they started to become more attuned to this. And one of the first to really become aware of this was Abraham Lincoln, who, of course, we think of as facing one of the greatest crises our country has ever faced, which was the Civil War. And Abraham Lincoln said, public sentiment is everything. He knew that in order to win the war, he had to enlist the support of the public, especially the people in the North, of course. And he did that in a number of different ways. But one example I'll show you, which I think is kind of a masterful bit of public relations, was the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, the Emancipation Proclamation he issued saying that he was freeing the slaves. But it's the details that matter. First of all, he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862 after the Union troops had won a victory at Antietam. So the war had already been going on. And he said that unless the southern states re-entered the Union and stopped their rebelling, he would free all the slaves in the South. And so he did and issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. But keep in mind, this only freed the slaves that are in the rebelling states in the South. And what was important about it is that now it gave the North a moral cause on which to fight, and understanding that they were fighting to free slaves and to end slavery. So, he was well attuned to how this public policy had to be carefully brought out and sold to the public. Now, of course, the spin continued to increase throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century as the presidents became more powerful. And also, the newspapers themselves started to change by the beginning of the 20th century. The party press started to wane, and newspapers started to depend more upon subscriptions and advertising to support their operations. And that changed the way they covered the news. First of all, we see that they became what we might call gatekeepers. They were taking all of the possible news that was out there and deciding what did their readers need to know. So they had to create authority in that case. The second way we think about them is they became a watchdog. They became watchdogs over government and industry, and making sure that the policies were being enacted correctly and people were being treated fairly. And we often think of that now as the term we call it as the fourth estate, with the three branches of government, the legislature and the courts. We now have a fourth branch, which is the media, taking watch and looking over these people. So the presidents in the 20th centuries got underway, were quite aware of the growing power of the press, and so they understood that they needed to exert a good public relations in order to bring that press on board and give themselves favorable publicity. And Teddy Roosevelt was a master of this. He was a very interesting man. He was born into a pretty wealthy family, and he was kind of a sickly child. He had asthma, he wore glasses, and yet in his, he created an image of himself, which was one of being a warrior, a strong leader. He really understood how important it was for public opinion to be on his side. And so he tried to, govern them from the masses for the masses, made his arguments directly to the people, and he traveled all over the country to get his messaging out. And one of the ways he was trying to cultivate his image as a warrior was the Spanish-American War. He raised a brigade of soldiers from folks he knew at Harvard and started training down in Texas. And interesting enough, he invited the reporters to come down. He had a sign posted outside the camp that said, "All civilians except reporters are prohibited from the camp." And his tactics worked very well. He goes down to Cuba to liberate the Cubans from the Spanish. And he was aided by a newspaper war, which was going on between William Randolph Hearst and the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, who was the editor of the New York World. And they were trying to get subscribers and boost their circulations. And so they covered the war extensively and exaggerated it at times. And one of the most interesting examples was when the U.S. naval vessel, the Maine, sank in the Havana harbor after an explosion. They were quick to point that this had been caused by a Spanish torpedo. And unclear really the cause of it, but for their mind, it had been downed by the Spanish. And soon all of America was rallying around this war and had the cry, "Remember the Maine." Well, it all worked out. And Teddy Roosevelt returns a war hero and launches his bid for presidency. And he has this, this image of himself. Here's to show it in this photo montage. It was, this image of the bull moose. He says, "I'm as strong as a bull moose, and you can use me to the limit." Well, skipping ahead a couple more decades, we go to his cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he again faced a serious crisis in his presidency, which was first the Great Depression and then World War II. And Roosevelt took advantage of a new technology that became available to get his messaging out, and that was radio. Now, at the time of this, in the late 1920s, people had started to become suspicious of newspapers. They started to think they couldn't be trusted. And yet radio, they felt, was the answer. Here they could hear voices come into their living room, and they felt that the people were speaking honestly to them. Now, Roosevelt took advantage of this perception, and he used radio to speak to the American public about his policies. The most famous was those of what he called the fireside chats, where he would explain things like his banking policies and why he was doing the things that he was doing. So we come up into the Eisenhower administration in a couple of decades after that, and we see now a new medium that is taking hold, and that's television. And we can't underestimate the power of television to get messaging to the public. Eisenhower used it quite forcefully when he went on to speak to the public after sending troops in to Little Rock, Arkansas, to aid school desegregation. And it was a very interesting clip. It begins, this live broadcast begins with, you see the presidential seal, and then it cuts away and you see Eisenhower sitting in the Oval Office. And one of the first things he says in his address is, "I could have spoken to you from Rhode Island, but I came to the White House because I wanted to convey the seriousness in which I've made this decision and in my intention to oversee school desegregation." And so now not only we have his voice, we have the image of a man sitting at in the Oval Office at the Resolute desk, surrounded by the American flag and the presidential flag, telling the public how serious he is about his decision. Television became, the main means in which presidents were conveying their messages to the American public. And at the same time, it also lent itself to changing journalism. During newspaper times, there had been very few star journalists. We had Nellie Bly, right? There have been some important editors who were very important in their own communities. There have been some columnists that people, had, celebrated and followed very religiously. But with television and radio and then television, we have what we call the start of the star reporter. They became, people that America could look to and trust to give their messages. And this becomes this quite a contrast and quite the conflict during the Vietnam War. We have now reporters going over to Vietnam and showing the American people what's going on in the war. And that often was at odds with what President Lyndon Johnson was telling us about the war, when he was telling us that telling the American people that we're winning the war and it's all going well. Now we have reporters going over there and showing us that things aren't going so well. This still image I'm showing you here is from a report that Morley Safer of CBS News gave in 1965. And Safer, he actually shows American troops burning the homes and huts of elderly Vietnamese people. And, these kinds of images just, outraged and disgusted the American public. And of course, contradicted what Lyndon Johnson had been saying. And Lyndon Johnson was very attuned to how, of the public perception of the war. And he knew he needed to win what we call the hearts and minds of the people. You see here this picture of him sitting in the Oval Office, 3 television sets that he monitored religiously, very worried about the news coverage that they were giving to the war. When Morley Safer gave his report, he called CBS News and he was outraged. He said that Safer had shat on the American flag and he wanted that news reporter fired. And of course, CBS News refused to do it. The war drags on a few more years, but it kind of reached a watershed when Walter Cronkite, who these people called the most trusted man in America, went to Vietnam to do his own report. He came back, and in February 27th, 1968, he took a rare step of sitting at the anchor desk of CBS News and issuing an editorial in which he said the only way out of Vietnam was to negotiate a peace settlement. Clearly the public sentiment was turning against the war, and within a few months, Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not be seeking re-election to the presidency. Television, as I said, continued to be a very important tool which presidents could reach the public. And they used that in times of crisis, such as George Bush, when he went on to speak to the American public the night after 9/11 and address the public about the terrorist attacks. Again, we see the image, which conveys to us the seriousness of this. He's dressed in the somber suit and the clear desk and just a very few photographs behind him, and the American flag and the presidential flag. And all of this lending itself to the image of a president who is determined and strong and serious about the action he's about to take. The images didn't always have to come from the Oval Office, though, to have an impact. Here we see a still of President Obama when he gave a statement about the Newtown massacre shooting at the elementary school in Connecticut. Obama was known as no drama Obama, he always under very controlled messaging. And yet when he spoke about this tragedy, he had tears in his eyes and he's seen wiping tears from his eyes. This gives the message, again, a very emotional message to the public. And we see how this can be taken, in a different kind of seriousness, of a sadder, more somber tone. And now we come to Donald Trump, who is a very different kind of president. And I would say that what I would call it the Twitter presidency. Donald Trump has had a very different approach to his media messaging. He has not tried really to enlist the help of the mainstream media to get his messaging out, as had been the case from presidents starting at Teddy Roosevelt and going on up. Instead, he has used primarily direct appeals through social media. You will see him on TV a little bit, right? They'll be shouting, the reporters will shout questions to him as he goes to the helicopter. Sometimes he'll give an interview to Fox News. And then, of course, we had those famous press briefings for a while about the pandemic, which were suddenly cut short after he came under attack for that time. He kind of went off the cuff and was talking about the possibility of ultraviolet light and antiseptics maybe curing people. And so he cut those out and he's gone back to primarily messaging through social media. And now this week we see an interesting development with that, as he's threatening to regulate or close down Twitter because it started to put on his tweets, some of them being, the veracity is not to be trusted. Nevertheless, we see that he has tried to approach his presidency by appealing directly to the followers and spinning his message to the most ardent of his supporters rather than trying to enlist the majority of Americans through mainstream media. And he's successful in this for a couple main reasons. One is that we face a serious media fragmentation, which probably we've never seen before. And we also see an audience fragmentation, which we've rarely seen. Here I'm showing a couple slides that show research that's been done by the Pew Research Center. And that shows a couple things. First, we see newspaper circulation is declining dramatically. And why does that matter? It matters because most reporting has been done by newspaper reporters. We think about the Pentagon Papers, we think about Watergate. a lot of this, most serious reporting has been done with newspapers. Television gave really important reports, but often they would be, more emotional reports, the images, and not necessarily all the facts. But now we see newspapers have declined, and with that, they've laid off massive numbers of newspaper reporters. So there aren't the same number of journalists on the ground trying to get, true reports out. The second thing we see over here is that in the other slide is how there is a fragmentation of where people are getting their news from. Television is still an important source of news for those who are over 50. But those under 50, it really splinters. And we see television is not the most important source. Certainly newspapers are not the most important source. We see that in the younger audiences, we see a real dependence upon social media and the internet, which tends to lend itself to kind of an echo chamber, of which everyone is sort of watching and listening to the same information they think supports their own views to start with. This, how's it all playing out in the pandemic, we see another piece of research from Pew. It depends on people's attitudes about the press and the pandemic depend upon where they're getting their news from. If they're relying mostly on Trump and the task force, they are saying that the news media is making a bigger deal of the pandemic than it should be. If they're relying on news outlets, local news, national news, they'll say, oh, the media has the coverage about right, or maybe he's even underplaying it a little bit. And most interesting, I thought, was the last line about those people who are looking at the public health organizations. 40% of them think the media is actually underplaying the crisis, and only 17% thinking that the media is overplaying it. And of course, this breaks down on party lines as well, in terms of who the people are trusting. Democrats and those leaning Democratic say that they generally trust the news media to give them good information and to serve the public, whereas those who are Republican, leaning Republican, say they distrust the media or don't believe they're getting the information that they need to know about the pandemic. So where does this all leave us now? Well, it leaves us in a very difficult situation. We are here this summer, just a few months away from a presidential election. We have some very serious decisions to make as voters and as citizens. We have to understand whose messaging are we going to believe. We are also still in the midst of this pandemic. We have to make decisions on, how and when do we go back to school or to work, or how do we socialize? Who are we going to believe? And I don't know about you, but for me, I was like, please just tell me what to do. I get so many contradictory messages. I see people acting out in so many different ways. I just say, please tell me what to do, what to believe. But honestly, we have to, avoid that line of thinking. We have to now become very critical thinkers and diligent consumers of information. And here's where I'll put a plug in for a liberal arts education and Hood College. That has been the mission of a liberal arts education all along, which is to read widely and think critically, challenge assumptions, and be discerning consumers and voters. And so that's where I guess I leave us is, it's no longer an easy fix to say, I'm just going to trust Walter Cronkite to tell me what I should think. We have to try to take our own initiative to seek out many different sources and use our own reasoning to come up with our best line of actions and best thoughts. All right, so that is the end of my presentation today. I don't know if we have time for questions, Peyton, but if we do, I'm happy to have them. Or if not, I'm happy to just ask you to send your questions or comments to me at atwood@hood.edu.
Well, thank you, Dr. Atwood. I do apologize. It looks like we need to go ahead and get the next session started, which is going to be Dr. Ann Stewart, and it'll be a mathematical perspective on COVID-19 and the pandemic situation. But I have saved the questions because we had some really great ones, and I'm going to actually go ahead and send those to you, Dr. Atwood, along with emails, so that way you can reach out to the people who put those in. But thank you so much for attending our Press and the Presidency session with Dr. Atwood. We do have another session starting in about 5 minutes, and I put the link where you can join in the chat. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks a lot. You take care.
Bye.